back. We are now in our final session of the day. In this session, we will examine the medical road out of COVID. We hope you've been enjoying the previous sessions, and I'm excited to be the host for this final session. Our first speaker is Susan Athey. She's the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. Susan's research focuses on the economics of the internet, marketplace design, theory, and intersection of econometrics and machine learning. And currently, she is examining how to create markets for new vaccines, something I think we can all agree is a priority. Susan, thanks very much for being with us. Susan, of course, is also an associate director here at the Human-Centered AI Center. So welcome, Susan, and take it away.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me here. And I'm excited to present this research I've been working on with a fantastic team of co-authors. Let me call out specifically Camilo Castillo, who's a graduating PhD student from Stanford off to UPenn next year. The work we're talking about is actually getting updated in real time. So if you're interested in learning more, we actually put up a little website that has an app that can allow you to do different types of modeling at acceleratinght.org. So the problem that was highlighted in the morning session on the economics of COVID was that actually we have not just an economic problem or a health problem, but the two are interrelated. It's not just that suddenly pulling a switch and reopening the economy will make things better, but actually workers and consumers need to have confidence about the health problem. At the same time, the health problem is also an economic problem because we need to make investments at the government level often, but also in the private sector in order to get the health solutions we need to happen as quickly as possible. It's not just a matter of science. The IMF estimates that it's about a $9 trillion hit to the world economy over the 2-year period. That's about $375 billion monthly. What we'll argue here is that advancing an effective vaccine by as little as 6 months could generate gains of over $2 trillion, but you could do it for about $100 billion. And that's basically the world's easiest cost benefit calculation because we're just off by an order of magnitude. The costs are much less than the benefits. And similar arguments apply also to investments in diagnostics and therapeutics. I'm also doing some work in those areas, but today I just want to focus on vaccines. So what are the market failures we have? We see a lot of in the press about how there's a lot of R&D going on in vaccines. And indeed, the initial R&D phase seems to be functioning fairly well. But there's another problem which is less well understood by most people. And that is that since most vaccines fail, firms typically don't want to invest in capacity at risk. Instead, they wait till the vaccine is approved. And what's different between vaccines and, say, small molecule drugs is that you can't just take the recipe and put it in a factory and start spitting out vaccines the next day. Instead, vaccine production is actually its own complicated process. There's R&D that goes into scaling up manufacturing capacity. And in fact, each step of the process and each step of each process in each new manufacturing facility has to develop a test, have that test be approved, and then, of course, you have to pass the tests for every step. So it's a much more complicated process than you might expect, and it's very difficult to accelerate that process in order and still have safety. So if we follow the usual procedure, we could easily have an approved vaccine, but still have to wait 6 months to get shots in arms at large scale, and that would be a $2 trillion delay. So first of all, we need to get firms to invest at risk. There's another problem, which is that firms also would like to smooth capacity utilization over time. And in most cases, that's also what the social planner would want. If you can use a smaller factory to produce the same amount of vaccine as a bigger factory, the smaller factory costs less. But on the other hand, in this case, we really want production to be as fast as possible. And so firms are going to have the incentive to build less capacity and produce vaccines slower than society would want. In this case, we want to build factories, use them really quickly, and then have them be empty later. It costs more, but the benefits are worth it. So to help address this problem, we want to think about a solution where we pay firms to invest in lots of capacity at risk before the vaccine is approved. But then we still have questions: how much should we build? How many vaccine candidates? And how should we look at that cost benefit calculation in an environment where we actually have to provide incentives to firms to do the things that we want? So the way we approach that is with a simple economic model where we solve the social planning problem first and then look at an appropriate incentive structure to make that happen. So for the social planning problem, we can start by thinking about what are the benefits of accelerating the production of the vaccine. So to start, at any point in time, we can think about the marginal benefits to vaccinating additional people in a population. Giving initial vaccines to priority groups has the highest bang for the buck. As we move through the population, the later groups have less social benefit than the early groups. So we model that with this sort of diminishing marginal utility. Now in this environment, we can just illustrate graphically what are the benefits from investing in more vaccine candidates. That increases your probability of success. And the higher your probability of success of achieving at least one vaccine candidate that has sufficient scale and time, the higher the benefits. If we build more capacity, we vaccinate people faster, and that shifts the curve over to the left. Now, with that in place, we can think about the comparison with and without the program. So if we let the status quo go and people wait to start manufacturing at large scale until after they know the vaccine is effective, there's a delay of, say, 6 months between knowing the vaccine is effective and safe and having vaccine production. And then once you start, you see this curve with diminishing marginal utility. On the other hand, if we accelerate capacity installation, then as soon as the vaccine is shown to be safe and effective, we can start vaccinating people at large scale. But another thing will happen is that as soon as you know that this vaccine actually works, you would want to increase your capacity investment at that point. What you want to do when you know that the vaccine is actually going to work is going to be different. And indeed, at that point, you can start compelling capacity, repurposing, and other types of things, make sure all the supply chain is focused on this one candidate. So you'll start investing in that immediately. And then, say 6 months later, you get another bump in capacity. And the overall benefit is the area under this curve. Now, if you subtract the social welfare with and without the program, you get this funny looking shape. Then finally, layering on the probability of success, the more candidates you invest in, the higher the probability of success, and so the more you can scale up this curve. Putting that all together, we then want to figure out how many vaccine candidates should we invest in. We did that by taking data from the WHO on the vaccine candidates. We accounted for their stage of development, and we also accounted for correlated risks among the different approaches and platforms that the different candidates were using. We use success probabilities based on the historical record, but also adjusting for the fact that everything's going faster this time. So fast is good, but that means that the risks associated with each step may be higher because we've gone faster and haven't gathered as much data at each step. We've put in also expert opinions in terms of what these probabilities are, but what we've learned is that people have very differing opinions about this. So we've provided this model at the website I mentioned, acceleratinght.org, where you can plug in your own probabilities if you want to see how that changes things. Now, every additional candidate you invest in is going to give you additional success probabilities, but of course there's diminishing returns. And so this diminishing return plot shows how adding additional candidates to your investment increase your probability of at least one success. We can then put that into the model, and we'll see this diminishing marginal social benefit from each additional candidate. We've assumed here a constant marginal cost, although more realistically, if there's supply chain bottlenecks, there might be some convexity to that. So what we end up with is an optimum of 18 drug candidates to invest in. Then finally, to think about how do we design the incentives. We recommend a combination of pay per outcomes or pull financing and push or cost reimbursement. Pull financing can be used to incentivize speed and performance. But it's expensive because, say, the 18th firm thinks they're not going to be very likely to succeed. And so you have to have a big prize for that firm to find it worthwhile to make a big investment at risk. So you can reduce the cost of the program by also directly reimbursing people's costs. And we recommend push funding of 85% of costs, not 100%, because we do want the firms to have some skin in the game so that we don't see poor quality candidates trying to kind of take advantage of the program. And overall, then we suggest that we should have a big price, like $35 a dose for the first billion doses. That creates kind of a race for speed, and $5 a dose for the next 2.5 billion. And that together with the 85% cost share, we estimate would be enough to get 18 candidates to actually participate in the program. So we also do some work looking at the benefits of international cooperation and the additional gains that can be had if countries actually coordinate some of their investments to get the best portfolio and avoid things like incentives for countries to expropriate or do export controls when they've all cooperated and all have a share of the vaccine pie rather than each going it alone. So that's basically the economic modeling we've done so far. And again, we're happy to get comments on that and discuss it further in the discussion part. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Yvonne Maldonado. She is a Stanford University Senior Associate Dean on the faculty in Development and Diversity at the medical school and a professor of pediatrics and of health research. Bonnie is an expert in infectious diseases and has focused on epidemiological aspects of viral vaccine development, kind of coming at the same question from a different angle. Bonnie, welcome, and please begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Russ, and to all of the other panel members as well. It's an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing, and this is only just a small amount of the many things that are going on at the School of Medicine. I think I would urge all of you to go to the rise.stanford.edu website to see what other opportunities there are, what research opportunities are going on, not only at the medical school, but across the university. So what I'd like to do really is focus just on some of the clinical and epidemiologic work that I've been doing since it just seems like forever, but it's only just been for the last 3 months or so. And so,
Hi, Bonnie, I am so sorry to interrupt your session here, but can you please go full screen? Perfect. Thank you so much.
And so what I have been working on, again, I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. And so the work that we've been doing here has really focused on, from very early on, meaning around February, we were approached to try to understand what kinds of things could we do given the nature of this potential pandemic. Of course, it had not been declared a pandemic at that point yet. And what I had discussed with my colleagues was really a broad-based, population-based approach, which is generally the kind of work that I've been doing primarily in the developing world, but also in some of the early work I did with CDC and the State Health Department in around prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And so when we looked at this particular problem, what we were trying to understand is what is the nature of the transmission of this virus from an epidemiologic perspective? How can we measure that? And one of the things we decided to do was here listed in number 1, which is a household transmission study, which would aim to understand how this virus is transmitted in households. And so given that we were able to engage with a donor fairly early on, that is at the end of February, and we were able to be funded the first week of March, which coincided with our ability within our Stanford lab to have one of the few non-federal testing sites available in the country. So our laboratory was able to set up a very highly accurate PCR test within our lab, and that was set up the first week of March. Now, we wanted to start enrolling families at that point, but unfortunately, I bring this up because it's relevant to future issues around how do we control epidemics and other non-epidemic infectious diseases is supply chain issues. We could not find swabs to do the study that we wanted to do. It took us a month to actually get the study going, not because we didn't have money or resources, we just could not find swabs. So the idea of the study was to really try to compare, to really do household transmission studies, identifying people who would come in to our hospital with COVID symptoms and see if we could have them PCR tested. And everyone who was infected with PCR with COVID was approached and asked if they would participate in a study where they would have they and their family members within their household have themselves self-swab for 21 days after infection. Now, remember, this was in March and April, so we didn't really know much about the virus at that point. One of the other things that we were able to do during that study was to actually validate a nasal swab assay, which actually has been accepted for publication now and will be published in about a week or so, where we looked at swabbing of the anterior nares or the nostril versus swabbing of the throat. And now we're doing a backup study swabbing of the nasopharynx, which is the traditional gold standard swab. And we were able to show that not early on that the nasal swab is actually quite accurate. So we're finishing up those trials. Sorry. We're finishing up those trials to try to get validation of that assay so that we can really get nasal swabs into the hands of our clinicians in the hospital at Stanford Emergency Medicine and elsewhere in the clinics. The other issue we wanted to look at was how quickly the virus would transmit within family members, how long people would shed the virus, and whether there were viral kinetics that we could identify that were important in patterns of transmission. And then finally, down the line, we hope to be able to harvest these viruses and then look at genomic patterns to see if there is any evidence for risk of transmission within these viruses. And so we're halfway through the study now, but my sense is that we're going to keep going to work on as long as we can recruit patients to really understand the definition of household transmission, because as you know, we're finding out more and more about how long this virus can be shed. So the second study was one that we were engaged with through a generous donation from Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg through the CZI, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the BioHub, and UCSF. And this is a large collaboration where we are going to enroll 7,500 individuals over the course of the next several months. And the study is is respect to two general populations. One is the population at large, representing 6 counties in the Bay Area. And we are trying to really define what is the new incidence of infection in that population, as well as what is the antibody prevalence in the population in the Bay Area between now and the end of December. One of the reasons we want to do this is to be able to understand whether there are hotspots that are turning up over time as we open up the Bay Area. And we've also engaged quite closely with the public health departments within the Bay Area so that we can let them know if we start to find hotspots. So we are in this process of enrolling these 4,000 people through UCSF, Zuckerberg, San Francisco General Hospital, and Stanford. We'll be following them through 9 months through December, or maybe longer if we can, to look for new infections, not existing, but new infections and new antibody seroconversion to understand who's getting infected and what the dynamics of that are so that counties can respond to those new infections. And then finally, the second study there under the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is really to look at 3,500 Bay Area healthcare workers, and those would be people who came to Stanford, UCSF, and Zuckerberg's San Francisco General Hospital, who were tested with symptoms, most of them with symptoms, and were found to be a COVID negative. But we want, again, to do the same thing to identify risk of incident disease and antibody seroconversion in healthcare workers in the Bay Area. And so we'll be following them as well over about 6 months. We're also going to be focusing very closely on those populations to look at the kinetics of the antibody evolution in them. That is, when do they develop antibody after infection? Do they develop antibody after infection? What's the nature of the antibody? Do they have neutralizing antibody? Is it protective against subsequent infection or exposure? Is it protective against infection of others? That is, will people become infected, but then spread disease to others? And this is critical because this happens with other viruses. For example, polio virus can be vaccinated against, and the vaccine is quite effective at preventing paralysis, but an individual with immunity can actually become infected over and over again and spread the polio virus and infect others and cause them to be paralyzed. So we really want to make sure we understand the kinetics of the antibody response to coronaviruses, specifically to COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. And then finally, we're developed a very large program to try to build out outpatient clinical trials here on the Stanford campus. Our first study is a lambda interferon trial that we're conducting now at the Galvez tents over by the football stadium. And
1 minute.
And then also 2 other studies that are pending with, these are antiviral therapies. The current trial, the lambda interferon, is an immunomodulator. We're hoping to get FDA approval shortly for the other 2 antiviral drugs. And we're also looking to partner both across the country and internationally with other institutions so that we can build out our portfolio of outpatient drugs. Because if we have a surge, we want to be able to have a toolkit of drugs available to treat the outpatient, which really is the place where you want to either eradicate infection before it gets into the general population, or to prevent people who have mild symptoms from developing more severe symptoms, which would lead to hospitalization. So that is really the major, just at a high level, number of trials that we're working on. We obviously have many other initiatives going on, including antibody testing, et cetera. And this is just a picture of the tent that we're working in to enroll our seroepidemiologic studies in collaboration with Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. We have a tent right next door that's just as large where we're doing our outpatient clinical trials as well. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to questions or comments later on.
Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for my video to go on. One moment. Thank you, Bonnie. Okay, we're back, and I'm here just for a second to introduce our final speaker of the session. Our final speaker is Eric Horvitz. He's a technical fellow and chief scientific officer at Microsoft, where he provides leadership and perspectives on scientific advances and issues at the intersection of technology, people, and society. Eric, thanks very much. If you want to share your slides, take it away, please. And go full screen.
Well, thanks, Russ, and good afternoon. So right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, our team published work led by my UW PhD advisee, Daly, on the use of machine learning to build models that can predict and alert physicians hours in advance about the likelihood that a patient would require a life-saving intervention. And the work was done with a focus on helping physicians to catch and plan for challenging cases of organ system failure, but it really foreshadowed the role of machine learning with responding to the pandemic. Now, 2 areas of opportunity with the use of predictive models to enhance the delivery of clinical care, such as providing guidance on whether a COVID patient should be admitted to the hospital, or whether a hospitalized patient will experience a serious adverse outcome, for example, requiring a transfer to an intensive care unit. And beyond the quality of care, these models can help with freeing up hospital resources. Another pillar of activity is in the public health realm, where models of risk can be used to guide the formulation of healthcare policies, as well as individual decision-making, I think, which will grow in importance with moves to reduce restrictions and various other approaches to opening up the economy. Now, on adverse outcomes, we're seeing a constellation of predictive models being developed by teams across the world that can predict 1 or more outcomes of SARS coronavirus 2 infection. The potential power of prediction is highlighted by work done several weeks back by CMU graduate student Benjamin Lendrich, who's now working as an intern with research scientist Rich Caruana at Microsoft. And what Ben did was he examined a very large and very messy open access data source put together by a consortium of multiple organizations you see here. And the consortium pulled together a large but coarse and messy data set on COVID-19 drawn from hospitals in multiple countries. Now, Ben sifted through thousands of records and did the tedious work of identifying outcomes available in a small fraction of the database of about 266,000 patients. And based on this, he built a predictive model with an interpretable machine learning procedure that performed remarkably well in being able to predict which patients would transition to ICU, intubation, or death. And as captured in this histogram here of patients by probability of adverse outcome, Ben noticed surprisingly high densities of groups of patients who were very likely to do well versus groups who would very likely do poorly in terms of the outcomes, like going to an intensive care unit, being intubated, or dying, all based on patient demographics and comorbidities. Now, although it was very messy data, the model and predictive power highlighted the potential opportunity to better understand patient risk. And pushing to explore higher fidelity data sets, the Microsoft research team has been collaborating. Just a fabulous group, what I call one of the centers of the storm at NYU Medicine in New York City. And this is with doctors Yin Pinyanapong, Jonathan Austrian, and Leo Horvitz, and others. And the NYU Health team has been working on building and testing different kinds of models leveraging data from thousands of COVID-positive patients. As an example, one of the models has been built to predict that patients will not have a poor outcome for 96 hours, where adverse outcomes include transfer to an ICU, intubation, a discharge to hospice care or death, and other outcomes based on patient information, including vital signs, lab values, and oxygen needs. Now, this work was undertaken to help physicians who are grappling with clinical uncertainties about patient trajectories based on vital signs and a whole set of lab results like markers of inflammation. But clearly, more accurate predictions could help augment clinical decision-making. The model performs well when tested on patient data, as represented by this receiver operator characteristic curve here, which captures on the y-axis true positive rate, and on the x-axis false positive rates at different operating thresholds. Now, beyond formal test results, when you introduce a predictive model into a clinical setting, there's a need for strong evaluations of what's the value of making these recommendations or evaluations available to physicians in real-world decision-making. So it's important to run studies, in fact, to do well-designed, randomized clinical trials of the value of the physician AI team. It's really nice to know that this is exactly what the NYU team is doing. They're looking to extend to do a well-designed, randomized clinical trial of the value of the physician AI team versus unaided physicians. And the idea is to not just work with their own hospital system, but to extend and recruit additional hospitals to help understand with randomized clinical trial with an AI system, how well these systems will work. Hospitals can get involved via outreach to Yin, whose email I've listed here. Now, note that performing randomized clinical trials of AI systems in real clinical settings resonates deeply with a theme at the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute, on understanding how people and AI systems can work together. Moving now to public health, there are opportunities to leverage predictive models built via machine learning for community or county-wide health programs, as well as in personal decisions. When moving beyond global policies like shelter in place, there are numerous designs and parameters involving mixes of sheltering, distancing, testing protocols, contact tracing to identify those who may have been exposed to the virus, and being sensitive to potential disparities and impact of the programs based on poor access to healthcare, health knowledge, effective shelter, and contact tracing. So it's clear that models of risk I have here in the center of the screen will serve a central role in these designs, and there's an opportunity to better understand how to stratify people by their inferred risk, both in terms of cohorts or groups of people, as well as individuals, as we want to understand how different sets of attributes lead to different levels of risk. Now, predictions of risk will be valuable in supporting public discussion, as well as in designing policies via optimization and undertaking rich decision analyses about the impact, costs, and benefits of alternate programs. Now, to date, high-level statistics are being communicated based on relatively coarse data from patients coming to the hospital. For example, on a community scale, Here's a map put together by a collaboration by Microsoft and the Dartmouth Atlas of the population densities of people at high risk in different what are called hospital service areas, where high risk is defined for different regions as the density of Medicare beneficiaries over age 65 and with at least 2 of a set of chronic conditions drawn from regional data.
1
However,
minute.
we can do better, and there's opportunity for harnessing machine learning to help people across the world answer questions like, what is the risk if I become COVID positive? And what is the risk if I engage in a specific activity? Now, just last Friday, in a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Mark LaRochelle sought to provide physicians with guidance based on core statistical data and the risks of particular activities, stating, as states move to reopen their economies, physicians should engage patients in individualized risk assessments. And he offered a matrix of advice with cells representing recommendations to patients at different levels of risk of outcomes given different activities. So, what should the physician be telling patients about what they should be doing given a policy? Now, a promising opportunity moving forward is to pursue data and approximation strategies for predicting the probability that individuals will suffer an adverse outcome should they become infected, or using the causal notation of Udea Pearl, a do COVID plus action. Set me to COVID plus, what's my risk? And this differs from models of adverse outcomes to date, which predict poor outcomes based on data made available via people who have qualifying levels of an illness, who have sought and have been able to gain access to testing. The data available is changing as testing becomes more widely available, and as hospitals begin testing all incoming patients, so-called incidental COVID positive, even if people don't have symptomatology. So there's a great opportunity in harnessing machine learning to help with clinical and community decisions for better understanding risks and trade-off. And areas of work here include doing clinical trials to understand the value of predictive models to augment physician decision-making, and in developing more precise and you might say relevant models of personal and community risk. And I'll stop there.
Okay, this is Russ. Thank you very much. I need to be enabled to start my video, please. And then I will. Thank you very much. Great. And that was our 3 speakers. Excellent. We want to remind you to ask your questions on the Ask Questions part of the site. I'm inviting all the panelists back. Susan, Bonnie, and Eric, my co-host Rob, we're all here. And there's a question that I actually want to start out from the audience because I think it's very important. One of the audience members asks, is a vaccine absolutely necessary to get out of this pandemic? And they then quoted some statistics about death rates and about potential complication rates of a vaccine. And I'm wondering, both for Susan, Bonnie, and Eric, is this a mandatory part of our strategy, or is it possible that a vaccine won't be an important component of the response?
Well, let me take that one first. So we know that with HIV, for example, we have no vaccine, and we do have prospects for control of the disease. But ultimately, if you really want to eradicate an illness, a vaccine route would probably be the best way to go.
Susan?
I'd just say on top of that, we really need all shots on goal here. So, it's possible that we could come up with a great therapeutic that people could get early enough that, they wouldn't suffer all of the different, risks and poor health outcomes, and that people wouldn't be afraid. But, to think about that, to make that work, you would need to have lots and lots of testing, because to try to catch this thing early, you would need to know early that you had it. And we're not there yet either. And then, it's lots of drugs have side effects, so they don't work for different people. So the idea that, we're going to be able to just get at this with therapeutics and diagnostics seems unlikely to me as well. However, that doesn't mean that we should slow down on our investments in diagnostics and therapeutics. And we actually are seeing, despite the fact that everybody seems to understand how important these things are, we're seeing underinvestment and lack of coordination and implementation, still today in all 3 of those areas.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, my reaction is we're all waiting, for a vaccine, and we have high hopes. In the meantime, coming up with great therapeutics to reduce some of the deaths would be fabulous. It's great to see at least some of the molecular dynamics and design efforts focused on therapeutics, the therapeutic set of courses, and for mitigation of the worst parts of the illness. I love Susan Athey's metaphor. As a hockey player myself, all shots on goal.
So Bonnie, another question that comes up, especially in your work, especially for your first two projects, I just wonder, is the ramp up of testing, both for active disease and serology, is that meeting your needs, or do you see that as a critical rate limiting step to your ability to get answers to the questions, the community-based questions that you're asking?
Yeah, so do you mean, do we really need to go out into the population and?
No, do you have the supplies? Like, are the tests
Oh,
there? Are
oh,
the serologies in
well,
place?
Yes, we do now. I mean, obviously, it's been, we have been cashing in every chip we can find. But we have a pretty good supply now. We've been shoring up suppliers from different parts of the world. We've been leveraging with the hospital. We do now have, by the way, 3D printed swabs that are that just got validated and EUA approval from the FDA. So the laboratory kits, we have multiple platforms. So it's not just one platform now. There are at least 4 platforms that we have. So I think we just have to leverage all of those pieces in order to do the testing. That's not just true for us. That'll be true around the world, really.
Important news. Thanks. Let me throw it to Rob, who I know has some questions.
Yeah, I got a question also from the audience that I think it's a sign of our forward-looking orientation here, that we're thinking about prospects for a vaccine, how it is that AI and other technological approaches could accelerate the production or discovery of one. I think an important question, just perhaps a factual matter, is essential here to put on the table, which is, who is the body responsible for deciding which populations of people receive vaccines if and when they're available? So what can we expect on the delivery mechanism? And then just to tie this session to the last session, if you think about, if you were listening to the previous session with Danielle Allen, Nate Persily, and Maurice Shaka, identifying a kind of social crisis that was happening at the same time as a public health one. We know, for example, that even if we rapidly develop a vaccine in the United States, there's a population of people who are resistant to taking it, even if it's available. There are people who resist downloading an app for contact tracing because they have suspicions about who might use that data. So in the spirit of thinking technologically, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the objective function here? If we only concern ourselves with vaccine development and treatment, but we can't get people to actually adopt them, we don't yet have a solution.
So I'm actually the liaison to the federal government. I'm the chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Infectious Disease. We make vaccine policy for 67,000 pediatricians around the country, and actually many other countries follow our lead. I'm also the liaison to the federal government's vaccine approval committee, the ACIP. And one of the issues that we are facing, and we just started a Lancet commission on vaccine acceptance. So we used to call it vaccine hesitancy. Then we called it vaccine confidence, and now we're calling it vaccine acceptance. Mm-hmm. We are seeing a remarkable overlay of groups that are coming together in very interesting ways. And as you know, there's already a push to to spread news about the harmfulness of vaccines before one has even been developed. So we know that there are some background work going on, and there's quite a bit of work done on who's funding those groups and how they're coming together. But the point is that hesitancy or acceptance, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a major factor. Again, trust and communication are really big areas of interest. We're trying to explore those areas, in our colleagues at the School of Education and others can really try to help us with that. Regarding who's going to do this and I'll listen to my colleagues as well, but I have a lot of experience with these programs. And the big problem we're facing is there's really no one head of, and no one person to tell us what to do, as you can imagine. So the World Health Organization, which I don't know if officially we're not part of it anymore or where we are there, but WHO generally has lots of regulatory, they have a lot of technical clout. They have countries really respond to, except for the few exceptions, countries generally respond to what the WHO says. These are the experts. Most of them actually are trained by us in the US, and they really do have the expertise and the technical capacity to make recommendations, but they are recommendations nonetheless. In the United States, this is exactly the problem. I don't know what you talked about before. Unfortunately, I had other commitments, but the problem we are facing in this country, among many, is that we are extremely decentralized about our approach. And that is going to affect what happens with this vaccine. That said, the ACIP, or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is part of the US Public Health Service, does make vaccine policy for this country, but they are recommendations. The states make guidelines for school entry. So that's how it's broken down.
Thank you.
So maybe I could just pop in on the world stage. It's actually pretty tricky to figure all of this out. And there's a lot of discussions going on right now, and still, I would say, some lack of clarity about who's leading which efforts. We're not seeing, a single country taking leadership over this. There are organizations like Gavi and CEPI that have existed for a long time and have a lot of background in terms of trying to get vaccines to the developing world. But even there, it's unclear exactly what the right answers are. There's epidemiological issues. We don't know yet who is actually most important in terms of transmission. We certainly want to think about healthcare workers, frontline workers, people who are out there interacting in service roles with the population, and we know who are high risk. But also some of the people who are high risk, the elderly, may also be higher risk for side effects from vaccines. And so trying to figure out that policy is, I think, an ongoing international discussion. And then also who gets it among different countries, and how do we make sure that the countries that have the money have sufficient incentives to fork up the money and contribute, while ensuring that the world is covered. Because of course, if we have outbreaks popping up one place, they're just going to feed right back into the rest of the world. So even from a self-interested perspective on the developing world, everybody needs to care about what's happening globally.
Yeah, so if I could just offer a gloss before you comment, Eric, on something you just said, Susan. I want to check that what I'm about to say is right. The cost-benefit analysis that you provided us in your opening slides about just how massively beneficial it would be to accelerate, even by a small number of months, the availability of a vaccine, doesn't yet answer questions about the public health guidance that we need on which populations should receive it, the elderly, our frontline healthcare workers, nor the political questions about whether or not which countries contribute funds for the development of the vaccine might have political claim on it for their own citizens prior to others. And so those are further problems for us to identify and address, it sounds like.
Exactly. You can have a sort of idealistic vision about, everyone getting it at the same time, but the facts remain that some countries have more capacity in their countries than others, and some countries have more money than others. And so trying to align everyone's interests is somewhat challenging. However, the optimistic note is that it's actually in the benefit of many, many countries, even down to the middle of the income distribution, to make some investments in this. And we believe that it's possible to have an incentive compatible type of program where, although it does require that the people who are putting in the most money get some priority for their own citizens, you need to have a benefit for the investment.
So Susan, just following up on that, there's been some questions about whose $100 billion were you spending in those simulations? And I think you're kind of implying the answer, but could you just say, what's the idea about where that comes from? And does it matter if it's 10 times 10 billion, or does it have to be 1 times 100 from a single country? Or
Yeah, no, we've looked at a bunch of different scenarios. So if you think about each country going it alone, you can still get a lot of social benefits because it's in the individual interest of a lot of countries to do that. Some of the concerns you worry about are that people invest too much in the same candidates. Also that you create supply chain bottlenecks and get insufficient diversification. And you also worry that if countries are doing everything completely independently, then people may not trust an investment they make because they're worried that the companies won't be able to follow through due to export controls or supply chain bottlenecks that are created when other countries try to get in on the game. So having some kind of contractual framework that everyone agrees to about respecting contracts, understanding that you have to make some commitments if you want people to make big investments. So those are some of the challenges that you have. And of course, again, we do want to be both fair and equitable, and also just from a self-interested perspective, make sure that we don't have hoarding in rich countries and less in poor countries.
Yeah.
The good news is, though, the rich countries just don't have that many people who want the vaccine. And if we invest in enough capacity, then we'll get to the people who don't want to take it in the U.S. And as long as we don't hoard that, hoping they're going to change their minds, we can start vaccinating other people while we're in process of convincing more people to take it here.
Yeah, let me just make a comment here that given what we currently know about racial disparities in rates of chronic medical conditions that couple with levels of education, healthcare access, distrust, and the data that shows that there's an overrepresentation of Blacks and Latinos in deaths. Recent New York City data was quite striking, in fact, that we need to be extremely sensitive when there's a rollout, especially under bounded resources, to do special efforts to address vaccinations of those communities.
Well, and then in addition, I think you mentioned Gavi, but unfortunately, Gavi really only deals with, well, first of all, CEPI hasn't been around only about 3 or 4 years. So they're just starting off and they're really focused on pandemic platforms. They don't really have a governance structure really per se. And Gavi is really dealing with the bottom tier countries. So if anybody has an advocate, it would be those bottom tier countries. It's about 70 plus so countries. So there would be some negotiation at the table, I imagine, where that they would come into play, and they can actually they can try to scale for the countries that they represent. So there are some precedent. There is some precedent. I think the pandemic flu of 2009, we saw some of this happen then. In fact, Indonesia at that time really felt that they were left out in the cold, if you will, because they were working quite a bit with some of the with the strains, and they weren't at the front of the line. And so after that, there was some mistrust around who's going to be. So there's more recognition that everybody needs to have a seat at the table. Where that table is and who sits at the head of the table is really the problem.
I want to switch a little bit to Eric. You showed some AI models for machine learning, and we're talking about fairness and disparities in the last couple of minutes. And as you know very well, one of the issues that comes up when you train on data that may have been affected by differential access to care, differential outcomes, there's a worry about those models being prematurely introduced and leading to increased disparities. I'm wondering what you think are the prospects for making sure that in the COVID case, we try to make sure that these are as good as possible and as fair as possible.
Yeah, what a great comment, Russ. I often say that it's great that this virus and pandemic hit not any sooner than now, given the rate of advancement in biomedical informatics, machine learning, molecular design and understanding, but also really great efforts on fairness in machine learning with the whole community around it. So I think it is a challenge. We do need to begin looking very carefully at those models, not just from an acute, we can get this model up and running and let's clinically evaluate it in terms of its efficacy in working with physicians. We need to also understand whether there are some systematic biases. Now, you might say that unfortunately, some of the systematic biases right now might be even aimed at the overrepresented populations of folks who are actually dying around the country. Again, the 92 out of 100,000, 74 out of 100,000 versus 45 out of 100,000 deaths in New York City, recent study showed. So, I don't like to say it's good news that the systems are biased in that way right now, potentially for the data, but I think that in general, we have to deal more globally with the biases. In particular, as I mentioned during my 8 minutes, the biases of how the data is being collected and tested based on access to tests. And that could, given there's probably reduced access to the racial minorities, it probably lead to another source of bias in the other direction. So thanks.
Can I jump in on that? I think
Yes.
one of the things that's important in trying to solve these problems and have better machine learning, more reliable machine learning, is having access to more data. And actually, one of the things that I've personally encountered in this crisis is how challenging it is to actually get data. So Eric had sort of a success story, but in general, trying to get patient level data that allows you to understand the full background of a patient, what drugs they've been taking, what their comorbidities are, and so on, has been very difficult. Health claims data comes available after claims are filed. So in the March, April timeframe, when all the people are coming to the hospital, some of the data sources that we often use in medical research that are broader and bigger were just not available yet. So then the data about the patients coming into the hospitals is actually sitting in hospital systems. Well, that's incredibly fragmented. They all have their separate EMR systems. In addition to that, there's of course patient privacy that needs to be protected, IRBs that need to be gone through, and coordinating PIs. So I was part of a team at Johns Hopkins and Stanford where we've been looking at a particular therapeutic. And we spent a lot of time going all over the world and all over the US, going from hospital system to hospital system, trying to find collaborators and get access to data so that we could run models, potentially pooling data across while preserving patient privacy, to look at whether, for example, drugs that people were already on when they came into the hospital made things worse or better for them when they came in to be treated for COVID.
Well,
And
let me add
the
to
data problems were just, enormous. And so in terms of like pandemic preparedness, at least for the next pandemic, we need to be able to react. Like, it was just insane to me that, no one in the entire US had a view on all of the data for these patients coming in. So we ended up collaborating with the VA, which has a very big system, and we're working on some analysis now from that system. And some countries, have systems where they had a real-time view. But that limitation of, without the data, you can't do any machine learning, let alone high quality machine learning that accounts for fairness and other issues. So I just think it's a huge policy issue that we need to solve now, but also for the future.
well, and
Bonnie, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that issue. I think some of the data, again, the data that you get is the data you don't know. There, as an epidemiologist and a lab-based molecular epi person, I would say that I worry about some of the data that is being collected because it's going to be biased. There's no question. I mean, we can't have perfect data, but the people coming into the hospital, especially if you look at disparities, may not be the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. That is, we don't know what's going on with the people who aren't coming in, who are not sick enough to come into the hospital. What's the real spectrum of this disease? You can't just look at that piece of it and say that this is predictive of a lot. This is predictive of who comes into the hospital, basically, is what you're.
Well, and the testing too. The testing was very, like, across the VA system, the testing was very different as well.
The second thing I'd like to say, please, is that the other issue that we're forgetting altogether here is the genomic aspects. We don't understand yet the precision medicine aspects and what's going on with the genomic significance, either of the virus or, more importantly, of the patient. So we don't know whether there are host characteristics that are skewing the responses. And there's some indication that that may be appropriate. We are trying to get that data now. We've certainly been working with the BioHub and here at Stanford as well, to look at those aspects. Are there issues around the host? And when you look at, especially at racial and health disparities, we know that in pharmacogenomics you find this, and it may be possible that this is happening as well. So I do think that these large data set approaches are going to be critical, but we also need to keep in mind that there may be some pieces that we're missing, much like you already pointed out. So as much as we can open up those data sets and even start to delve into unexplored areas where data sets are not being kept, would be really helpful.
Well, With that, I want to end the session. I want to thank Eric, Susan, Bonnie for your insights. We are clearly still in process, but we very much appreciate your insights. I'd like to ask Rob to join back. I'd like to ask our panelists to turn off their video as we do a quick wrap up of what was a quite striking day, I think, Rob. Your thoughts?
Yeah, indeed. Well, we held our first version of this on April 1st, now a second version, June 1st. The idea that HAI might hold another one of these in 2 or 3 months, possibly also once again in an entirely online format, seems to me possibly inevitable, but also dispiriting. It awakens us to just how enduring this crisis is likely to be. And what I have in mind, just by way of a kind of brief attempt at summary or synthesis of what we've heard today, is that we organized this entire half day to look at the economic path forward, the social path forward, and the medical path forward. And one of the things which I want to insist upon noting, because I think it's an underappreciated aspect about this, and it's something that we can point to that's hopeful. The people who joined us today as experts to talk about this are just a small fraction of the number of scholars and other leaders who have completely redirected their own professional research agendas in order to confront and address the crisis head on. It means that we have extraordinary amounts of talent trying to work on the problem. And the conversation today makes me think that we have to first appreciate the scale of the problem before we might imagine viable solutions to it. Not just a medical question. Yes, we want technology, AI, machine learning to accelerate a path toward a vaccine or to help us identify clinical protocols that will enable better outcomes. But we also have a social crisis, an economic crisis, and more than anything else, as Danielle Allen, I think, rightly put her finger on, a crisis about the social contract that binds us all together and worries about whether or not trusted institutions, independent of expertise, independent of solutions on particular fronts, will allow people actually to adopt solutions if and when they're available. So we're in this for the long run. We might have some improvements in the public health dimension of the crisis in the near future, but the social dimensions of everything are going to take a long time for us to crawl out of. And this is an all hands on deck moment. To crawl out of this and to rebuild and reestablish trust in our social institutions will require, the work of years, not the work of months.
I agree, and thank you for putting it so well. I'll just add that you might not have heard about a ton of AI today, but as those of us who are working on AI try to anticipate solutions to the problems in society, it's precisely this 360-degree view of all the ways in which technology can impact the society that will lead to deployments of AI that are helpful, positive, and useful, and not negative. And so we don't really apologize about the fact that AI is a little bit in the background today, because that's the point. AI should be in service of these bigger challenges that you just heard 9 amazing scholars and workers talking about. So I think that if you're okay, Rob, we will call this a conference.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone watching that all of these videos and the entirety of it will be available on YouTube later today, possibly in just a very short amount of time, and that individual sessions will also be available on the HAI YouTube channel in a matter of days.
If you're on the HAI mailing list or registered for this event, you will receive that link very soon. You will also receive a survey. We want to know if these are effective, if they're hitting the mark, or if they're missing the mark. So your opinions are quite important. Thank you again for making the time to hear about this important research today. All of us at HAI care very deeply about the global pandemic and wanted to bring our expertise and our network to you as a public service. We hope you found it useful, thankful. Thank you. And until next time, stay safe.